Oh, kia ora, Donna. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, nā rangatira. Nā hohoki, nā mihi nui a koutou. It's my pleasure to acknowledge the First Peoples of this nation in the first language of mine, and to acknowledge those who have come since and those who wish to come again to this wonderful, beautiful land here. It's always a great pleasure to come back to Brisbane, to come back to Griffith University, where I spent 4 wonderful years completing my PhD with Professors John O'Toole and Bruce Burton, and to see my good friend Penny Bundy and Madonna and others in that, and Brad Hazeman, who's arrived perfectly on time. Kia ora, Brad. I couldn't possibly have said any more until you come, my friend. So it's a great pleasure to be back. I am a New Zealander, so I know there are many New Zealanders living here now in Queensland, but I will speak somewhat slower. And if you need some translation devices to help you through, rugby would be better. Thanks, Brad. So as I said, it is great to be back here. Had I the heavens embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread them under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams. I've spent much of my life in applied theatre working in dark places of the human spirit, whether that's youth justice facilities, psychiatric hospitals, or schools, all of which share some alarmingly similar characteristics, as those of you who teach can only attest. But certainly some of the darkest places that I've worked in the last number of years have been in Christchurch. And much of what I want to talk about today is based on what I've learnt through nearly 3 years of ongoing work in that fine, beautiful city, working with many of its youngest citizens. On February the 22nd, 2011, I was supposed to be in a meeting with a colleague and friend of mine, Stephen Dallow, who some of you in this room will know. He managed the theatre company that I founded, Applied Theatre Limited, and we were supposed to be in a meeting, and I didn't go. And I got a message from Stephen on my phone at 12 minutes to 1. And it contained some really good funding news. And so I was walking to my car in Auckland, and I decided, instead of sending a message back, I'd give Stephen a call. And I rang him, and he said, "Oh, just a moment, Peter, there's a lot of reconstruction noise here, so I'll just move away from the building." And I knew where he was. He was in Cash Hill Mall. And he moved away, and I just heard the one word, quake, and the phone went dead. By the time I had walked to the car and turned the radio on, they were already announcing 7.1 earthquake had struck the city, and they already knew people were dead. I waited for 4.5 hours for another message from Stephen. At which point I'd been in touch with his wife, I'd seen his children, and we'd waited. And the message came through saying, "I'm out, I've seen things no one should ever see, but I'm okay, and I should be home in the next day or two." Stephen always answers my phone messages now. He says it would be silly not to. He was standing outside the CSL building where 132 people lost their lives. And if you'd turned left instead of right, I'd be telling a very different story tonight. New Zealand's a very small nation, And we often say that rather than 6 degrees of separation, we have 1 degree. We know everybody, and everybody knows everyone. It's one of its great strengths, and also one of its great annoyances, that you can't go too far without meeting someone you know. So when the earthquake struck, of course there was Stephen, but my sister also lived in Christchurch. And I got through to her, or she got through to me about an hour later, and she said, "It's bad." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, I've nothing left." And I said, "Nothing." And she said, "Well, I have 3 cups left." And I said, "What, no saucers?" And she said, "Nothing." And I said, "Well, Mum would be horrified. No point having cups of tea without a saucer." And my sister came and lived with us for some time. The earthquake happened at 10 minutes to 1, and there were 150,000 children at school at that time, and it was in the middle of lunch for many of those children. So they were playing outside, or they were returning into classrooms, and many of them then waited on the grassed fields for their parents to come and collect them. One of the things that you need to know about Christchurch was that there were 5 major earthquakes, but in the 3 years there's been 14,000 aftershocks which have rattled that city on an ongoing basis, which I've been in 40 or 50 earthquakes or aftershocks in the last 3 years, but to imagine living through thousands of them day after day is beyond comprehension in many, many ways. And those children waited on the fields as the city rocked and rolled underneath its feet for hours. Some parents came, and of course some parents didn't come for their children. But not a single child died in a school in Christchurch during that fateful day on the 22nd. Schools closed, and they closed for a varying length of time, depending on the damage that had been caused to the buildings, and also whether or not electricity could be returned or running water, whether they could get the sewerage back up. But the first schools opened in about 10 days after the quake. The media was full of this idea that when schools returned, Christchurch would return to some kind of normality, that it would be the marker of the beginning of the end, or the end of that beginning period at least. And I wondered what it was that I might be able to do to help. Simple kind of thought, don't you, when you know your brothers and your sisters and people that you know, and I'd worked a great deal in Christchurch, were going through some incredible pain. And I wondered too about those teachers who would have those children come back to the site of the trauma, who would come back to the place where so much had happened, and what they would do, and how prepared they were to work with the children. The Ministry of Education had helped by putting out 3 directives for teachers. And I don't wish to be overly critical of the ministry, because certainly the local ministry did a tremendous job in supporting schools and the rebuilds and so forth. But the national ministry had a very different role, and the Minister of Education put out an advisory to schools that when the children came back, it was very important to ensure that they had their hands washed, that they had lost up to 2 weeks of instruction in literacy and numeracy, and that the return to school and the importance of returning to normality would be returned to the kinds of things which were important to focus back in on, and that of course was literacy and numeracy, and that students at the senior level were instructed almost immediately after the quake that their examinations would still occur at the end of the year, and it would be really important for teachers to get young people to focus back in on the examinations. So you can imagine there was some burning resentment amongst teachers I'm being filmed, aren't I? But one might describe the sheer idiocy of such an approach to what was happening. And I wondered, especially for the classroom teacher, what was it that they would do? Would they work with the stories when they came back? Is that what you do? Or do you work somewhere else? Or do you find some other way in? Or I was very fortunate to get the support of my dean. I'd only actually been working at the University of Auckland for 3 months. And I went to the dean and I said, look, I want to go to Christchurch, I want to take a team down and I want to work with the kids when they come back to school. And he said, yes, sure, we'll give you some money to do that and we'll help with the logistics. And so what we did was we organised to go down 10 days after the quake. They were still at that point recovering bodies from the inner city. And I worked in a school on its first day back. And what I'd arranged through learning through the Arts Trust, and a colleague and a friend of mine who lives in Christchurch, who'd lost her own property, had organised so that teachers could come and see me work with the children, and that would provide a model for them when their children came back. And on the second day of the work, I'd work directly with the teachers, and I worked with between 70 and 80 teachers on the second day. And what we did was to look at how we might use drama in particular, but a range of different arts modalities to work with children when they first came back to school. So what I want to do in this talk today is to talk about what happened in those initial days, but to try and draw some links across to what that might tell us about education in the arts and what that might achieve at times of crisis. I'd been lucky to have I'd sent an email, I think, to Madonna and Julie Dunn, who many of you in this room will know. And I'd said that I was heading to Christchurch, and Madonna said, do you know the story about the dream cloth? The cloth of dreams. And I said, no, but I'm trying to work out what to do. Could you send me it? So she did, and I never really read much beyond the first sentence. It was enough. It was enough to give me the work for the couple of days that I was in Christchurch, and actually enough to sustain the work for the last 3 years. A really good teacher resource sometimes is like that, isn't it? You just need that one little thing that will set you on your way. We flew down to Christchurch. I boarded the plane, and I was and I went with one of my PhD students, and we were one of the few people on the plane not in uniform. They'd given furloughs to the rescue and recovery workers for a couple of days, and they were flying them back down to Christchurch. And I remember feeling very humble on a plane with people who were really going down to save lives. And applied theatre can do many things, but it doesn't literally save lives. And feeling very humble amongst these people who were going down to risk their lives once again in the rubble. We drove into the school, arrived into a small hallway, and there were 20 children came across, sat down, and there were 20 teachers who watched us. It was a 4.2 earthquake that reminded me exactly where I was at that point in the children, and then we began our work. And I started by saying, would they be happy if we worked with a story? And they said, that sounds really good, Peter. So I said, the story goes like this. A little girl wakes up in the morning, and when she wakes up, she finds that her cloth of dreams has been torn. And so I said, what kind of story do you think this is going to be like? And one little boy said, it's going to be a sad story, Peter. And I said, why do you think it's a sad story? And he said, well, if you tear your cloth of dreams, maybe all your dreams will leak off and you'd have no colour left in your life. And I said, yes, I think it will be a sad story. I didn't bring the picture book that I usually have to tell the story with me. That's a great technique, as many of you know from process drama, isn't it? I forgot to bring. So I'd forgotten to bring the book, and I said, what do you think the little girl looked like when she looked at her cloth of dreams and saw that it was torn? And one little boy went, shocked. How could you tear a cloth of dreams? One little girl was like this, little Rodin, the thinker. Oh my goodness me, how could this possibly happen? And one little boy was like this, really angry that something like a cloth of dreams could be torn. These were children who knew a great deal about torn cloths of dreams, and they knew what it meant. So I asked them, would you like to help the little girl in the story? Now, the wonderful thing when you ask 6 and 7-year-olds that, they immediately say yes, don't they? Because they haven't become adults yet where they ask whether or not you're going to create a culture of dependency by helping people. Or, what's the motivation behind helping these people? Surely they could help themselves. Isn't it important that if you have your cloth of dreams torn, that you do it for yourself? But if you ask young people, children, they immediately say, of course we'll help. Of course we'll help. So I said, well, what do you think we could do? Now, one of the great things about my teaching of drama is I've never been a great planner. And really it was about as far as I'd got, because I'd spent 4 days trying to work out where I could do this, how I could get a plane down, where I might be able to sleep the night. And I actually hadn't had time to think much beyond the first line of the story and the first question. Fortunately, well, not so fortunately, not surprisingly, one 6-year-old said, what we should do, Peter, which is always the way, like they know, don't they? What we should do is we should loan her our dreams, put them on a blank cloth, on a spare cloth, and she could use those until she gets her cloth fixed. You see, that's the beauty of when you're 7. You see, you're prepared to give other people your dreams for a while. You can loan them out, and it doesn't really matter if you don't get them back. So I said, well, that's a great idea. And it just so happened, I said, almost like they do on the cooking shows, I have a cloth right here that you can work on. Now, the wonderful thing about 6 and 7-year-olds, when they draw, they don't sit at the edge of the cloth, do they? They climb onto the cloth and they draw around themselves. And they drew some truly beautiful things. One little girl drew herself on a unicorn flying over the land of everything that's good. Both her grandparents had died only 10 days before. Another child drew herself with her friend who had moved to Nelson because she no longer had a house. But on the dream cloth, she was there with her still. One of the teachers picked up the crayons, climbed onto the cloth, and started to draw herself. And she drew a huge oak tree with enormous roots. And the roots were dug deep into the cloth and they reached right down to the edges of the cloth. And I spoke to her after the workshop and I said, what was the story with the tree? And she said, during the quake, I was in the centre of the city. I had the day off. And I was in the centre of the city and I knew that the safest place to go was Hagley Park. And those of you who know Christchurch, it's an inner city park. And she said, I thought to myself, if I go to Hagley Park, there are oak trees there that have been there for over 100 years, and that will be safe. And she said, I got to Hagley Park, and the trees had been turned upside down, and the roots were facing to the heavens. So I had the chance to put the tree back where it belonged. And that's why I drew the tree. I put the tree back where it truly belonged. So we did this beautiful work. We spent some time and I felt really good and thinking, well, that's my first 15 minutes of the lesson. What do I do next? Which is always the way when you're working with little ones. And I said, well, that's great. That will be a lot of help. And then the same boy, no, Peter, we said we'd do this while we got her dream cloth repaired, fixed. I said, that's right. How do we fix a cloth of broken dreams? It's a great question, isn't it? It's a question Christchurch has been working out for the last 3 years. How do you fix a cloth of broken dreams? different little girl said, you'll need some magic thread. And I love Christchurch because it's a very English city. We'd say cotton in Auckland, but in Christchurch they say thread still. So you'll need thread. And I said, magic thread? Those of you who know Dorothy Heathcote, this was a very Dorothy question. I wonder where you'd get magic thread from, I said. And they said, oh, well, you make it. Oh, wonderful, I said. So you make magic thread? Yes, we make magic thread. So I had small pieces of paper and I got them to work in groups to work out the ingredients for what would go in the magic thread. So they worked in pairs and they did all this and they worked out the ingredients that would be needed. And then I said, so what do we do now? And one very bright girl said, you put all the ingredients together. I said, of course. Where do we put them all together? And by now she was convinced I was a complete idiot. And she said, you will need a cloud bowl. Which is true. If you've ever put magic ingredients together to make magic thread to fix a dream cloth, you know exactly what you need, which is a cloud bowl. Now, I've been teaching for 30 years and I think this is still one of my better questions. I said, have you got one? To which she said, yes, over there. Which was really lucky because otherwise we'd have had to have made a cloud bowl or found a different one. It didn't really matter, but it was, So we went over to the other part of the room and we stood around the cloud bowl. And what I loved about the little girl was she was very exact about where it was and not to get too close, but to get ready to put the ingredients in. So we stood around, myself with the 20 children and the 20 teachers standing in the circle behind. And then I said, so what do we put in? And one little boy said, you will need 3 bales of belief. And I said, I thought first, see, Christchurch is a farming community, which is why it was bales, which I thought was fascinating, wasn't it? And it was 3. It was exact. And in all the ingredients, there was always exact measures. And another really good question, is belief heavy or light? And he just looked at me and he said, belief is heavy. It is heavy, isn't it, if you live in a city rocked by thousands of earthquakes? So we had to haul the belief together into our cloud bowl. 1, 2, 3. And I felt really good because we'd covered literacy and numeracy in the lesson. So that was particularly good. I thought, if the ministry were going to audit my class, I could say, look, they did some writing and they've also done some numeracy. They had some tremendous other ingredients to put in. 3 cups of love, 17 giggles that you share with your mother before you go to sleep. So we giggled 17 times in and put them all in. And I thought we'd finished. And I said, is there anything else? And one little girl said, yes, Peter, you will need a teaspoon of light from the darkest tunnel. And I said to her, how do you put a teaspoon of light from the darkest tunnel in? And she said, it's like this. And she held out the teaspoon, leant across, and she said, you sprinkle it. See? The light goes through everything. So I looked, and so did everyone else. And I said, see, it does. The light indeed did go through everything. I turned around and the teachers behind me weren't seeing too much at all. They were too busy wiping away the tears which had collected in their faces 10 days after the quake. The children looked at the little girl who offered the gift of the teaspoon of light, with a sense of wonder themselves that someone knew that. How do you know that? How do you know that's how much you need? How do you know how to use it? How do you know that the light can do that? What an amazing gift for them and now for us, because we now know the story of the teaspoon of light offered in the darkest of places. The wonderful thing after that was that we looked, and of course we had incredibly strong thread, didn't we? I mean, my God, and look what it had, bales of belief, love, giggles, and light. So we made the thread, we fixed the cloth. Molly, my PhD student, lay there on the ground, and we wrapped the cloth over her. We crept away very quietly because the dreams were back, patted ourselves on our backs. And one little boy said, "That was great, Peter. We made a sad story happy, didn't we?" I said, "Yeah, we did, didn't we, today, here in this room?" So that was the very first experience of working with a group of children, and the next 2 days carried other stories. Maybe not as powerful, but often just as moving. I then continued to work in schools in Christchurch for the following 3 years. We took eventually a theatre company called Teaspoon of Light Theatre Company to tour the most quake-affected parts of the city, and they had a 3-hour interactive traditional theatre and education program where the dream makers arrived with torn cloths that needed fixing, and they understood that these people might be able to help, and parts of the way in which that worked was to actually lift the dreams off cloths and make them dance inside people's bodies, which was just glorious, glorious work. You can see this work on YouTube if you look up Teaspoon of Light. You can see the children dance. But what I wanted to do, it's a very powerful story, and I've told the story a number of times now. But what might we learn from a very simple drama? Very simple, isn't it? I mean, when you think about it, one line of a story and 4 questions. That's all it was. Sometimes we overcomplicate teaching, don't we? It seems. One of the things I think that I learned very much from that experience was that after disasters, there's a huge willingness and need and a desire for people to connect and engage with the world again. And that's just as true for 6 and 7-year-olds as it is for adults. It's really important for people to see themselves not as victims, but as people with an ability to be agents in the world, even if it's just in the fiction, even if it's just for the moments of putting together a dream cloth. If I think back to the making of the tree by the teacher, there's an incredible need to reconnect to the past, to heal the things that have been broken, but it's not the place to stay. It may be the place to begin, but there's other work to be done through the arts as well, and it's not about telling the stories of what has happened, but to reimagine the possibilities. And to do that through the arts seems to be the really powerful way to work. When I think of that little girl who offered the light from the darkest tunnel, I've often thought about, and it's a teaspoon of light from the darkest tunnel, I've often thought how she knew that it's not light at the end of the tunnel, but that the most powerful light is in the darkest of places, is in the dark of the tunnel. And if you want light powerful enough to make the change that you want, that's where you have to get it from. How do you know that at 8 years old? Or perhaps more importantly, how do you forget that if you knew that at 8? And what's our role as educators in reminding us and knowing the wisdom that young children might have? And this idea that a teaspoon is enough. That's all you need. If it works with the other things, hope itself isn't enough, but it has to work in partnership with the belief, the giggles and the love and all those other kinds of things which work in partnership together so that the light might spread through things. I'm aware, of course, of the potential of the arts, and it's really only the potential of the arts in this work. Much is made of, by some, of the ability of the arts to transform, to change the world. Well, they didn't in Christchurch. Their lives weren't changed by that work. Mine was changed forever by the work, because I was a witness of it. But they still, when they left school, had to deal with no running water, thousands of shakes and all those kinds of things. I don't think it necessarily transported either. Helen Nicholson talks about the arts don't transform, but they transport us. They take us to somewhere else. And they may have for fleeting moments, but that doesn't seem to me to be what the true potential of the arts might be. And I don't think really they transcended the moment particularly. But what they did do, and I think where the true value of the potential of the arts, is that they provided moments of humanity. Simple, really. Moments of incredible beauty amongst ugliness. Moments of light amongst the dark. And it seems to me that the arts, as a notion of the possibility of resisting that which dehumanises, that which strips away who we are as human beings, is the great potential of the arts in education. And that's what I'm reminded of when I think of the teaspoon of light. I'm also struck as a teacher, of course, by the power of genuine questions. It's so obvious, isn't it? But we kind of forget it sometimes, that really it's asking questions that we don't know the answer to, that provides a kind of learning which is truly energizing. So when you ask a child, what do you put it in? And she says, a cloud bowl, rather than saying, yes, any other ideas? Valuing and judging it against others, which is kind of what many teachers are trained to do, aren't they? Take a multitude of different ways of asking, but asking instead, do you have one? And the wonderful thing about that question is there's no right or wrong answer to it, is it? If she said no, well, that's fine, we'll have to find one. But if she says yes, then the follow-up question is obvious. Where is it? And the power that that child has in saying, over there it is, to actually create a cloud bowl by answering a question. And that's the power of genuine questions when you work in the arts, of not knowing the answer to what it is that you ask. And being prepared, of course, when you ask the genuine question, to go wherever it might take you. Because if you said, no, I don't know exactly what I would have done, but I would have done something else. And I guess that talks then about what Eisner referred to drawing on Dewey, the whole point of flexible purposing. That when you start teaching, especially in the arts, you may have no clue at all where you're going to end up. And it's fine. It's okay. Keep asking the genuine questions. Keep trusting that the children will take you to the place that you need to be. Seems to me that's the great joy of asking those kinds of questions and working in the arts. Those of us who are artists in many ways know that we start a whole range of things without being too sure where they might be. And that's what you do. And you find yourself somewhere else. And where you found yourself is okay. And that's true when you teach in the arts. So learning intentions and all the other things which clutter the thinking of teachers, sometimes we need to just kind of pull them back and just teach what we see in front of us. Those children struggling to find the way to fix a torn cloth of dreams. In Christchurch, in New Zealand, we have what's called a futures-focused curriculum. So our Minister of Education constantly says that the purpose of education is to prepare children for the 21st century economy. Chilling words, aren't they? Absolutely chilling words. Nothing to do with making sense of the world today. Nothing to do with equipping children with the idea that they might change the 21st century, but simply as people prepared for everything that the 21st century might chuck at them, rather than what they might give back to the 21st century. And what was really interesting for me as I did that work was that this was work which was very rooted in the present, making sense of what was happening by imagining what might be instead. Ministry of Education's response to my work in Christchurch was really interesting. They decided what I was doing was not educational, it was therapeutic. And I don't think when they said it that they were being complimentary. And I think it's because of that kind of discourse which suggests that schooling is around preparation for. And what became very clear to me in the work that I've done since in Christchurch is that when you have a futures-focused curriculum, that if the present changes, teachers really struggle because the curriculum can't speak. What do you do if you're preparing for the future when you don't know what the future is anymore? And one might suggest that's true of all futures, but very true of cities in crisis. I spoke to teachers who said, well, when we taught after the earthquake, we could change how we taught, but what we teach is fixed. We can't change that. And that's part of the disempowerment of a futures-focused discourse, which says, ignore the present and train purely for the future. And if you have a government which believes the future is tied up in the word economy, it's even more narrowing, of course. I've retold the teaspoon of light in many places, and I find it resonates with teachers in so many different ways. And I think what it does, it resonates because it reminds them in many cases of why they became teachers. It's really that simple. It's kind of this belief that a teaspoon of light's enough. That you can work with kids and you can have moments of awe, gifts of surprise, as Helen Nicholson describes those moments. That they're still possible in a system that's so hidebound, that's so tied up with deliveries and outputs and outcomes and God knows what else that strangles creativity in classrooms, that despite all that, good questions and the arts can take you to places that you couldn't imagine before. And that's so refreshing for so many people engaged in arts education. Finally, I guess the teaspoon of light is a place of possibility. And it teaches or reminds me that hope begins with a leap of the imagination, and that it requires a leap of the imagination to believe that we don't have to live and die in the world in which we were born into. It's the belief simply that the world might be different. And that may be the false promise of hope. It may be the optimism that Karl Popper talked about, which he said was a moral obligation for all teachers to be optimists, to believe that the world might be different than it is. But I truly do believe it's enough to sustain people in their work, because all of us, all we have are teaspoons really in terms of our contributions that we might give. And that the end of this work is not about creating hopeful individuals, but hopeful citizens inside communities. It's really important that the people of Christchurch see themselves as hoping for more than themselves, but that they might see that they hope for people and other people who've had their cloths of dreams torn. It's vital that they see themselves as hopeful citizens. Ben Okri, another poet, suggests our old dreams are exhausted. Throughout the world there is a cry for a new way of being, a new freedom for social justice and fairness. One of the most fundamental cries springing from our hearts is that these earth-shaking times are in fact giving us a new chance to redream our lives, and we should take it with courage. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you very much. there's a number of things to me about the different stages in a post-disaster. So the immediate response period is really important because artists and teachers can't do the work that we were doing immediately there, and so it was really useful for us to go down and to provide that kind of support immediately after. As the Christchurch moved into a very tentative recovery, so moved from the immediate response into a recovery process, what we started to do was to work with local artists and local teachers and to work in a far richer kind of partnership way. So the Teaspoon of Light company, for example, was staffed by local teachers, local artists, local dancers, local musicians, and that was a really important part of the process for us of, in a triage sense, being there immediately after to offer the kind of support that we thought the arts might be able to provide at that part of the process. But in the longer term, being able to engage and to operate in partnership with local artists has been a really important aspect of that, and working alongside teachers as well. So one of the examples, after we'd done that initial work, on the Friday, I worked with 70 teachers. Those 70 teachers then went back into the eastern suburb schools. When I returned a week later, classrooms throughout the eastern suburbs were covered with dream cloths in their windows. I mean, it was one of the most wonderful sights of my life, was to see these cloths hanging everywhere. A week later, 2 or 3 weeks later, we'd set up a blog for teachers and artists so that they could connect in and we could provide advice and support from Auckland. We didn't have funding to be there, and it wasn't a good time to be sort of in the way as well in the immediate response period. But we started to work with a whole range of different kinds of drama processes, and one of them was a response from a teacher who said they'd done that work, and one child asked the question, what if you put the thread in the cloth and you fix it, but you can't stop looking at the thread? Or what if you fix the cloth, but the dreams don't work anymore? So what was really interesting was that the metaphor was able to be extended in a whole range of different ways. And then when we developed the Teaspoon of Light travelling theatre and education program, that involved dance processes in it, and we worked with dancers to help devise that. Our last work, which was in March of this year, was working with children who were establishing Teaspoon of Light centres in schools. And so if you had problems, you could go to these 7 and 8 year olds who established all sorts of processes to check out what issues could be helped with a Teaspoon of Light, which could be administered to you. So, which is tremendous fun. I had all sorts of issues resolved by these 7 year olds, not permanently, but so I think it's really important now as Christchurch moves into another phase, what kind of role Teaspoon of Light as a concept now has in terms of our work alongside those communities. Because what we did was we devised up with them lesson plans, or lesson structures for them to be able to then, when their children came back, that they'd be able to begin to do that, and we worked with them to think about the other kinds of steps that they might be able to take. I was really lucky in that Ginny Thorner, who then became the person who directed the Teaspoon of Light Theatre Company, her house had been largely destroyed and she wasn't able to get into her own school for 3 or 4 weeks, and she worked alongside teachers in schools as that happened. I did that for a period of time, and there were a number of other people who did that. We provided support through the blog system, so they were able to connect into the University of Auckland site. So there were a whole range of different ways in which that was able to happen. In Christchurch?
Yeah.
No, we sought funding. Sort of like a Kafka bureaucracy tale. This one, I applied to the Earthquake Commission in Christchurch and said I'd really like to set up an applied theatre project to work in schools, especially with young adults. And I got this lovely reply back which said no schools had identified a need for applied theatre. So, which was kind of, which was really which is true. None of them had, but there were a whole range of issues that I thought applied theatre might be able to, and that became an incredible tangle of. It's really fascinating, and it's a typical story of disasters. Huge amounts of money that then become incredibly tied up in bureaucracy, and all sorts of programs kind of fight and struggle to get hold of money to do a whole range of different projects. We were so intent in our work with the little ones, and we eventually went down as low as 3 and 4 year olds in early childhood centres, but we didn't go up into secondary. The earthquake had quite localised impacts across the city. So you could be, in one suburb where there'd been very little left or liquefaction pouring in through underneath the ground, and down the next street, absolutely everything's fine. So there were parts of the city that were operating and have operated reasonably well right through the whole process. So there's all sorts of those kinds of things that were happening. One of the real lucky things for me was that I had strong local connections, and I'd done a lot of work through learning through the arts that were connected well into schools, that knew drama and arts teachers, that had good connections with principals. So what that was about was we didn't go through any official channels. We just Facebook, social media, Twitter, which was the way in which we got the 70 teachers to the. It was one of the more bizarre days I've spent. We actually did the training day. It was a glorious sunny day in February in Christchurch. And we were 5 kilometres from the city centre, which was still cordoned off, where they were still recovering bodies. And they were playing golf at the golf course just by the airport outside where we were doing our work. So there's a strange juxtaposition of normal everyday events in this city of incredible chaos. But quite often, and those people who've worked in those kinds of crisis zones, you spend most of your time sorting out logistics than actually planning or working out what you're doing. You don't actually, just trying to find out where you can get a room to work. You couldn't ring because that wasn't possible. A friend of a friend of a friend went around on a bicycle and found a place where we could work. Actually had to go to the venue and look for himself to find a room that would be big enough to work in, that was safe and all those kinds of things, and check it out for himself, and then send a text. And then that's where we went. So it's those kinds of ways of working sort of add to the whole business, really. Those of you who've worked in developing countries will know it's a very similar process anyway.